Hey everyone, RJ here. Today I am back with part 2 of converting this snowboarding landing page to working and functional code. Now, if you haven't seen part 1, I recommend going to watch it first, since we break down the design and talk about the structure and approach for coding it up. Now on the screen, we have VS Code pulled up on the left-hand side. We have an index.html file, and we have some basic HTML template here with some meta tags which describes our current document. We have a link to a Roboto font which comes from Google Fonts, and we can essentially just say Roboto here, go to Google Fonts, and I am using the regular, medium, and bold. Now you can copy this link here, and that is what is pasted in right here. And when we move over to the styles.css, I have the font family, which you can see on the right, within our body. So it applies that font to everything within our body tags. Now, we also have margin and padding of 0 applied to all elements, and a box sizing of border box applied to all elements as well. So I'm going to get right into it. Let's first essentially wrap this entire design in a div. Now, you could do it that's probably with the body as well, but I kind of like to separate them both. We are going to be adding a class of flex. I talk about this in part 1, but flex will allow us to space out elements within a div, and it's used a lot in responsive design. So what we can do is display flex, and this is where that responsiveness comes in. We can use flex flow. So flex flow allows us to say, hey, we want the elements within this div that is a display of flex to be in a row. The alternative would be a column. So items would be stacked on each other. With row, things are next to each other, like in the nav bar, home, about, to the right. And then we also have wrap. So if elements within this div extend outside of the div, they will wrap underneath. So you'll create like a second row, for example, of these elements. So now that we have that and it's applied, let's add our image. That's going to be the first thing that we add today. And I didn't talk about it yet, but we have this assets folder with this snowboarder in here, which is going to be obviously this large snowboarder in our design. We have also 2 SVG images. Now we can add this by putting in a source tag and by saying assets snowboarder. Cool. So if I refresh this, we should see it now. Awesome. Now there are some other things that we want to add to this. I'm going to use a class and I'm going to call it snowboarder. You can use an ID too, because I probably won't be using this a second time. My O is actually broken, and sometimes it double types the O. But let's go over here now, do snowboarder. And what we're going to do is, in the first part, we talked about how when we scale from a desktop to tablet to mobile, we want this right portion to go over the image. So in order to do that, we are going to set this snowboarder to absolute position. So what we're going to do is position absolute, and we're going to position it at the top of 0 and left of 0. So it's going to position it at the top left. That won't change anything when we refresh, but now it's going to stay there. It won't move at all, and it won't affect our container. That's going to be on the right side. So what we can do is create another div and give it a class of container. This is going to be holding all of our text content. Now within here, we'll start with the nav. The nav will be within a div as well. And like I was saying with the flex before, the nav holds 4 different elements, and these are all going to have to be spaced properly and equally for when we scale responsively. So we want that space to remain, everything spaced evenly. So as we go down here, we can add a class of flex. And we'll also create another one for nav. And this nav will have a couple different attributes. Now, nav will have a width of 512, and I am roughly getting these values from the design itself. So we'll have a width of 512. We'll have a font size of 1.2 EM. EM is important to use for both accessibility and responsive, design, because this value will essentially, your font size will scale based off the width of your screen. So if you're on mobile, your font size will be a little bit smaller. If you're on tablet, your font size will get bigger. It all is relative based off that 1.2 EM value. Now, we are also going to need to add a font weight of 500. And those are the different font weights that we grabbed from the Roboto font in Google Fonts. We're going to add a letter spacing because it looks good and makes those nav items a little bit more unique from the other text by spacing them out a little bit. And this is where the justification of the content, when we were talking about spacing out those elements evenly. Now, justify content is something that works hand in hand with flex. So your display needs to be flex in order for justify content to work properly. So we can see, for example, when I add an A tag, which is just basically a text, that's going to be home. So I was wondering why that wasn't showing up there for a second. Now, I forgot to add in our container class within here. So we're going to add that. And essentially, this is showing to the left right now. And when I say this, I mean our actual container. So we want to add a margin right to that. And we're essentially going to say, hey, bring this all the way to the right, and then add a margin of left to auto. So we're going to fill that open space to the left. That will put our actual container right here. So on top of this, we'll need to do some padding and some other things. So just to get that done now ahead of time, we can add a padding of 48 pixels and 128 pixels. And this first value is going to be the top and bottom. This is going to be left and right. So we'll see now when we refresh. Cool. So that's looking about right. So back to the actual spacing of these elements and the use of the flex box. So we add another A tag here and we say, now we want the about. We are going to see home go here and about go to the right side. When using space between, it will put the first two elements. So the first one will go to the left side. The second one will be spaced evenly. So the space between the two elements will be even. So the other element, the second one, will go all the way to the right. Now, when we put in a third element, the space between all the elements is going to have to remain the same. So where's this one going to go? Right in the middle. Well, to the right. About went to the middle. And for our fourth one, we will have contact. Now, if we hover over this, we can see, cool. This is great. This is exactly what we want, but the line height is a little bit low. So if we're going to click on this nav, or a user is going to click on this nav, this is quite a small box to click on, right? So there's two different ways you can do that. I mean, one, you can put this in a div and add a little padding to them. But the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to add a larger line height. So I'm going to add this class of nav item to all of these different nav bar items. And I'm going to create this nav item class and add a line height. And this line height is going to be roughly 5 EM. So it's going to change and get bigger and smaller as the screen gets bigger and smaller. And if we refresh now, we can see they move down a little bit, but the top and bottom line height is larger. So the button click area is bigger as well. So to go on to the next thing, we have our header. Now our heading has two different things in it. It has an H1. I did not mean to do an actual heading. I'm just going to use a div, and then I'm going to put a H1 in here of snowboard. And this is the text that's going to be in the middle. And we are also going to need a chevron image, which is this */arrow. And that's going to be used the exact same way as the snowboarder. We're going to put a source on there, and we're going to say assets and chevron. Great. So now we have both of these things. One thing that we are going to have to update though, and you'll probably notice it, is snowboard is not properly formatted at all, right? So we're gonna have to fix that. And we are also going to have to put these in a flex box. You can notice that this fills up a row, the chevron fills up a row, and the heading fills up a row. This is a great example of where flexbox comes into play. Because if you can see right now, I'll add class of flex, and just like that, they're on the same row. So that's great. One thing we will need to do is add a little spacing to the right of this chevron. So we'll add a class. Once again, I'll only be using this once, so you really can just make it an ID or something, but doesn't matter too much. So chevron, and then we'll just add I believe it is going to be just a margin right of 16 pixels. Cool. So now we have that. Now let's format this heading. So we are going to want all of the H1s within the application to be the same font size. So that's going to be 4.5 EM font size, and that's going to be 4.5 EM, and we are going to want a font weight of bold essentially, which is going to be 700, again coming from that Roboto font. And we want a color of FA1616, which is going to be the red color. So now as we refresh, awesome, cool. We're making good progress. So as we continue down, you'll see that there is a large amount of space here as well. We are going to need to add that in. So let's create another class for the heading. Now this heading will have a couple different things. It's going to have a padding coming from the top, and it's going to have an increased line height. So I'm going to have 96 pixels from the top and a bit of an increased line height of 3 EM. So we can see that. Move down a little bit. Move down a little bit too much. Let's take a look at that. So over here we have our flex. It's a div. Okay, I see what the issue is. So we're not adding this here. We're going to be adding that to here. And now if we refresh, that should fix itself. Awesome. Cool. So great. Yeah. So essentially by adding that padding top to just this individual element, it was making it significantly lower than the other, as well as the line height was making it significantly lower than the other. Okay, great. So now that we have our heading in there, we can then move on to our subheading, which should be fairly simple. We'll put a class here just for the subheading. And just like the H1, we're going to put an H2 in here and then just mess around with the font size to be the font that we are looking for. So I'm going to pull in the text here, and we can then move over back to the CSS. This H2 is going to have a font size of 2.7 EM. And it's also going to have a font weight of 500. Now, we need to add a width here because obviously if we don't add a width, our text is not going to wrap. It's just going to keep expanding like that. So we'll add a width of 532 pixels, and we'll add a line height of 3 EM. Cool. So to adjust this heading now that it actually meets, we can increase this line height by a little bit. We can put that to like 5.5. That way this heading is now spaced out a little bit more and it matches up better. We can then move on to the paragraph, which is going to be probably one of the easiest things. That's just going to be in a div with a p tag. And this p tag is going to have this giant block of lorem ipsum text. Awesome. And within here, we can have a class of actual, we can just call this content. And we can come over here and start creating this class of content. We can do a couple things. Let's add a width because we want this information to wrap again. We're gonna use the 532 pixels from above. So if we refresh this, we currently have that. Let's also add a margin to the top. And that margin will be 48 pixels. And let's add a margin to the bottom of 16 pixels and increase the line height to 1.6 EM. Now it looks like the font is not scaling properly in terms of it was not set properly. So let's take a look at that. So we have our font size of 1.2 here. And, you know, we can really just take this and put our font size in there and we should be fine. Awesome. So now that we have that, we can go over here. I'm going to turn this cursor off. We can go over here and this is shaping up. All we really have is the button left. So we can move over to our button and add that in right below our p tag. So let's put in a div here. And our div is going to be a flex because we're going to have multiple of those different elements for the button in here. And within this, we are going to have a span, which is going to be explore. Span is used for when you need text, essentially, like short text like this, that won't be linked to anything. So I won't be linking this actual text to anything. I'll be linking the div if I were to do an on click. And we also need to add the arrow image. We do an image tag, put a / at the end, and we put a source. We're going to have assets, and we're going to put our arrow in there. Awesome. So what does that give us? Cool. So that gives us our explore and our arrow. Now, to add the underline and to space these out a little bit better, and I believe the text needs to be a bit bigger as well. So let's get to that. We can first add something like explore. We'll make like an explore kind of class for this. And our Explore class will have probably a bunch of things. It's going to have a font size, first of all, because the font is too small. That's going to be 1.2 EM. Now, we want a border bottom. I talked about this in the first part about the different ways of approaching this. And I'm going to add a just border bottom to the bottom of the div to add this underline of 2 pixels. As we see, we get a line, but the line is too long. So we're going to set this button to be a width of 140 pixels. So that should fix that issue. We also want to add a font weight of 500 and add some additional padding. We can see that this Explore and arrow, they're not exactly lined up right on the left-hand side there. So we're going to add some padding of 8 pixels and 12 pixels. We're going to increase the letter spacing just a little bit by 2 pixels. We are going to, once again, justify the content. So you can only use this when the elements are in a flex box. And we're going to use space between again to space these elements evenly. Now we can refresh this. And we're having something that looks much more like the end product. Now, if we inspect this, we can see that, okay, I'm looking at the colors here. We can see that we have a color of 313131. What is the color of this? The color of that looks black, and we want a color of more gray. So we're going to change that. And I believe I'm just going to set this for the body. And we can do that now and essentially just say color hashtag 313131 hashtag, but it's a hexadecimal code. And we can refresh that. Awesome. So we have all the proper coloring right now. And we can also add an overflow of hidden here. Just so if anything crazy comes along, nothing weird happens. We know everything's going to stay on this page. There's not going to be any scroll wheels coming up, and nothing's going to get wonky. All right, so just to go over this stuff one more time and make sure the design is as close as possible, we have the header up here with the 4 different nav options of home, about, products, and contact. Below that, we have the snowboard heading with the chevron image to the left. Below that, we have a subheading with just basic 313131 color text along with everything else. And below that, we have a paragraph. Now, to me, this paragraph actually looks a little bit too spaced out. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to change that to 1.3. That looks a little too low now. We can do 1.4. And that looks about closer to this. Also, with this Explore, let's see, this is 313131. And our bottom border is also that same. I believe I checked that before, but this bottom line looks a little bit too thick. So let's change that to just 1 pixel. And that looks a bit closer. So I think lastly, it's going to be important to add a little margin to the top of this Explore button. We have the paragraph here that we just kind of tweaked a little bit. Now we're going to be doing the same for the button, just making sure our final product is as close to the design as possible. So if we had a margin top here of 16 pixels or 32 pixels, that looks great. So that looks extremely close to the end product. Now, in the next video, we'll be going into more of the responsive CSS. So we'll be doing media queries, and along with that, we'll also be doing some animations of the buttons, and I'll be talking about on clicks for the nav bar and the Explore button. So just a little bit more in depth into some CSS and a little bit of HTML. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in part 3. Thanks for watching.